I go to this computer. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. Today we have a pleasure to have Carmen Lee. She's a postdoc in North Carolina, and but she's Canadian, and she's going to talk about microscale insights into structures and rigidity in granular materials. At the beginning, Carmen, well, already thank you for being here, and if you can present a bit like what was your PhD about and why you're here in North Carolina and why rheology? Were you interested in rheology like early or not? Tell me a bit more about that.
Now?
Yeah. No. You can start to explain where you come from and so on.
So I did my PhD at McMaster University in Canada.
Okay.
And my PhD work was primarily on the flow of droplets and bubbles. So I looked at how capillary scale droplets will transport themselves along a conical fiber due to the surface tension of the liquid and the viscosity of the liquid, and also how bubbles transport themselves through a fluid and kind of can cause this buckling instability
Mm.
inside of a liquid. And it was all viscosity driven, which I thought was just like really cool. I moved away from fluids to do this postdoc in granular materials. So I went from caring about viscosity and surface tension to now caring very deeply about friction
Okay.
between grains. Um, and I think one of the things that I really liked about granular materials is that there's a lot of analogy to liquids, and being able to look at it from a rheological point of view
Yeah.
was really cool.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, thank you, and we can have a lot of chat during the talk because Carmen can answer all of your questions. She doesn't want to let anyone aside, so don't hesitate to ask questions during the talk. And yeah, let's go. You can start to share your presentation, and yeah, the floor is yours. You can if it works.
Yes. Can you see my
Yeah,
screen?
perfect. Oh yeah,
Perfect. Okay.
very nice. Thank
So
you.
thank you for the lovely introduction and the invitation, Leah Michelle, for having me come to this really interesting seminar series on rheology in general. I'm probably going to take you a little bit away from the materials in which you're comfortable, or at least I hope I'll take you a little bit away by asking you to think about rheology in a particulate system where we can take images that look like this that you can see here, and which is a quasi two-dimensional granular material that's photoelastic, meaning that we can see where the stresses are in as we're applying a shear to it, and use it to try and understand things like structure and rigidity and how that informs flow in these systems. And so just to make sure everyone is on the same page, we're going to start with very basic, what are granular materials? And of course, we're all familiar with these because we walk on them every day. They compose the earth on which we walk. So this picture is from the Alberta Badlands in Canada, and you can see that there's a really nice stratification in these layers. And the other thing that I want you to see is that when material flows from high elevation to low elevation, it forms these really angular and regular angles of repose. So these cone-like shapes. And the reason that it forms these cone-like shapes is because gravity is pushing them downwards and friction is resisting that. And it sets up this stable angle. We can go beyond our own planet. We can look at a picture from the Curiosity rover on Mars, and you can see that the tire tracks, as it looks back on this dune that it just crossed, maybe rather romantically, if you want to anthropomorphize it a little bit, you can see that the tire tracks in this fine powder are very different than the tire tracks in this coarse rubble. And that essentially says the rheology is different, right? We're able to impact into this sand more than we can impact into the gravel. And of course, you know this as you've walked on granular things before. We also see granular materials fail. So this is a satellite image from the Piqiang Fault in the northwest corner of China. And you can see the stratification used to line up once upon a time. So the rocks were deposited in these matching colors. But over time, there's been a failure. We've seen two tectonic plates slip past each other. And this fault has moved almost several kilometers. But the failure area is only a couple of 100 meters. It was a very localized failure, and we'll talk about that later. And maybe more tangentially or tangibly, for the coffee drinkers in the audience, you'll know that whole coffee beans act very differently than very fine espresso powder. And so that's essentially what granular materials are. They're just a collection of these macroscopic grains that interact with each other, maybe usually due to friction, sometimes in forms of collision. And you can, of course, add complexity to the system like we always do, or say you can add liquid. Now we have capillary bridges that form and stabilize our sand piles. We're able to increase the angle so that our angle of repose is much higher. Or you can add electrostatics, like this poor cat, where it's been attacked, if you will, by this electrostatically charged granular material coating the cat. And it's cute in this case, but it's actually a really big problem in developing Martian or lunar rovers, where those powders on the surface of the planets can become tribocharged and they'll stick to the rover. So that's something that engineers need to think about as they're designing that. But even beyond this further complexity, even if we just think about dry granular materials, we can get a really interesting set of behaviors. So this is work done by Fournier and Poulequin, where they took a pile of ball bearings and they poured the ball bearings into this two-dimensional pile. And then they left the camera shutter open on their camera. And you can see from the reflection points, there's areas with lots of motion up here, and there's areas with very little motion. And you can map these in an analogy to the states of matter, because I'm a physicist and I love making analogies to things we understand. And so what really transitions us from gaseous to liquid to solid is the packing fraction. So how densely these materials are packed. And of course, something that's really interesting is not where the analogy works, because we understand that, but where the analogy breaks down. So for the gaseous case, these aren't just large molecules, they are athermal particles. And so to make them act like a gas, you need to be constantly giving them an energy input. We have to shake them. Brownian motion doesn't really exist here. In the liquids, we see both collision and friction between all of these particles, but we also see something called shear banding. And we saw an example of this by the fault plane in the earthquake picture. So we only see failure over a very small region relative to the stress that's being applied. And then the other thing that these materials are, although can act like a crystal, they're often disordered. And so when we sustain forces on them, the way that they're loaded is not homogeneous, like you would expect for a continuum material. And really, this transition between a liquid-like behavior to a solid-like behavior is something that we see often in failure. So here is an example of a grain silo that was previously acting like a solid. Something happened, and then the grain poured out acting like a liquid. And this can be really catastrophic and lead to loss of life. We also see it in the case of landslides. So we see this formerly stable solid hill slope, then failed in a liquid-like manner, flowed down and covered up. This is the Highway 1 in California. So it was a very large area and material that's been displaced here. And then closer to home for me, these are the dunes in Prince Edward Island, Canada. And you can see that there's a really nice sand dune that is no longer there because there was a huge hurricane that came in, adding in all of this energy and liquid and moved all of that material out of the way. And so from a geotechnical point of view, we can ask, the million-dollar question is, can we predict when this failure happens, both for natural hazards and as well as man-made hazards? But from a physicist and maybe a rheologist point of view, we want to know when yielding happens. So there's a whole range of how we can ask this question. And as a physicist, the easiest thing that we can do is look at how we can measure deformations. And for a bulk material, a solid material, this is pretty easy. You can take something like this gummy bear with a known length and cross-sectional area, and then you can apply a force to this gummy bear. And from this force, we can measure what's essentially the pressure, if it's in line with the cross-sectional area. And we can also measure the strain by seeing how much it deformed under that known stress. We can also be mean to this gummy bear in other ways. We can apply a shear by applying a stress perpendicular to the cross-sectional area. And again, same units. And one of the length scales or the non-dimensional numbers that we really care about in this system is the resistance to deformation, or the stress ratio, this ratio of stress to pressure. How hard is it to deform this material? And so this number, this mu, will come back many times during this talk. And of course, we can be mean to this gummy bear in all kinds of different ways, combining the different forms of pressure and shear. The other thing that we can think about is that's for a bulk material. But what about if we go back to our granular material, our canonical pile of sand now is heterogeneous, or your pile of gummy bears if you so prefer. It's heterogeneous. There's areas with gummy bear, areas without gummy bear. Some gummy bears might be softer, some might be harder if they're stale. It's also really nonlinear. So as you apply stress to it, it's not a linear stress response. These particles are large and macroscopic, so that means that we end up in a metastable state sometimes because they don't have Brownian motion to kick them out of it. And it's also really important how we prepare this pile of gummy bears. You could imagine that if we were to go ahead and measure the bulk friction coefficient, or this critical stress ratio, if we change up how these gummy bears are packed, now a different gummy bear is going to receive a lot more of the load than other gummy bears. So the way that it deforms probably will be different. And what would be really useful is if we were able to see how these gummy bears are loaded. And so that's where we come back to these photoelastic particles. We're able to look inside and see where the stresses are concentrated. And for your reference, these discs, these photoelastic particles, are about a gummy bear. They're about the level of elastic modulus and size as a gummy bear, except they're just circles. So think of it as a circular gummy bear, if you will. And the way that these work is photoelastic materials change their birefringence with an increasing stress on the system. And so what that means is if we take a light source and polarize that light, as the light interacts with the photoelastic material, it will rotate the polarization depending on how much there's been stress on that photoelastic disc. And then we're able to, when it passes back through another polarizer or through an analyzer for the lipsometrists in the room, we're able to detect those stresses. And so up here, you can see a video. Initially, there's no stress on this disc. I apply a stress using these tweezers, and you can see the stress field form. And as we get to higher and higher stress, we see these fringes appear. And everything that I've shown you so far has been done in white light because it's pretty. But in lab lighting, we typically stick with monochromatic light because it's a lot easier to work with. And you can see that in this pile of 5 discs, as I apply a stress to them, we go from having no fringes to having many fringes. And what's really nice is these discs are perfectly solvable. So if we know the contact points, we're able to extract exactly what the stress pattern should look like. So we can get the contact vectors between each of these particles, and we're able to then solve what the vector forces should be based on just changing how much force is and what we expect the stress optic response to be. For those of you that are familiar, this is the same essentially a very similar technique as polarized light microscopy. I thought this was really cool. This is a midge larva that has birefringent organelles, so they can track that. Of course, this is not as solvable as our rather boring discs when we compare it to this cool system. So the way that we have a software package called the photoelastic grain solver for those of you who are interested. And we've recently released a new version of it that essentially allows us to take a color image like this with our boring lab lighting. And is a color image where we illuminate the particles with red light that's unpolarized. And stealing from confocal microscopy, we split our two channels and we're able to look at the particle position and the particle size using just looking for circles. In the green channel, we're able to see how all of these forces appear. And from that, we're able to solve the particle contacts and their vector forces. And then as a check, because these should be perfectly solvable, what we can do is reconstruct how we expect this stress field to look like for a given particle. And what we're able to do is just as a double check, make sure it does something that makes physical sense or makes sense compared to the image. So that tells us that at least what we're doing, we're able to get relative forces that make sense next to each other. And so what you can see in these pictures is that we have this really interesting force network. Yes, Leah.
Yeah, I do have one question because first of all, I love all of this, the cat, everything, okay? But here when you say particle position and size, you don't know the dispersion of the size in your channel, or you're taking like random size, or do you have
We typically stick with bidisperse
okay.
mixture, because that just is, these particles are really nice to use, but they're hard to fabricate.
Okay.
So having just a set two, and it's typical in granular material to stick with a set distribution of usually a bidisperse system. And you don't want to
Okay.
stick with a monodisperse system because then you get crystallization.
Yeah,
So
okay, I see.
yeah.
Thank
So,
you.
but
Very
this
clear.
allows us to solve like where's a big particle, where's a small particle.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very nice.
cool.
And you follow them. Well, okay,
Yes,
sorry,
with
continue.
time. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, and so we see this network of forces that we see in many other particulate systems. So we see them in two-dimensional emulsions, which you can track by how the foams, each circle deforms. So the larger the force, the more deformation on it. You can look at it in dense suspensions. So usually you might see this usually in shear jamming. And then you can also see it in systems like colloidal gels. I really like this paper. They fluorescently tagged their colloids so that they were able to look at where the overlap between each particle was, and then reconstruct the force network based on that. And of course, you can increase the complexity by making it an active system. So you can also do a very similar technique using tissue or cellular tissue and how those grow heterogeneously. Now, everything that I've showed you so far has been pretty static, and we're in a rheology seminar. So let me show you some rheology. So this annular shear cell, it's quasi two-dimensional with all of our particles. And now I'm showing it to you in our boring lab lighting with red light showing our particles and green light showing our forces. We don't see any green light right now because it's in a no stress state. So what I'm going to do is just rotate the inside of our Couette cell. And you can see that these forces appear. They move quite erratically. And it's compared to, say, a fluid, it's very heterogeneous. There's areas with lots of forces, and there's areas with very few forces. And as we watch it rotate around and around, these areas move. So there's a lot going on here. And something that I think makes granular materials really interesting to study is that there's a poor separation of length scales. So on the macro scale, we have things that we've already talked about. We have the effective friction coefficient, we have the flow patterns, and we have rigidity of the material or yielding of the material. On the micro scale, we have how these particles can interact with each other, usually on the frictional case, and so we can measure who's in contact with who. But there's also this mesoscale that shows up. You can think of it in these force chains, which are really attractive to the eye. You can see like this force kind of travels some distance and then it maybe disappears. And so they're really attractive for us to look at, but poorly defined to actually measure. And there's been a lot of study trying to figure out what's the length scale of these force chains. And we also see something called shear banding. So this is this idea of failure over a very small region. And just to convince you of shear bands, what I'm going to do is instead of plotting or showing you the forces, I'm going to show you the particle positions as a function of time. So these are the tracing of the particles. And if I plot the velocity profile as a function of the distance away from the center wheel, you could see that the force or the motion of these particles pretty much falls to zero about 7.5 particle diameters away. And then the particles don't move. Tracing is a little bit misleading to the eye because it shows all of the data. But once we get to steady state, we get this really set exponential decay and then zero beyond that. And so if we made our sample size even bigger, if we made a larger annulus, we would still see this decay of 7.5-ish diameters. This is compared to a Newtonian fluid, which we would expect to just see hit some maximum speed close to the wheel and then decay to zero or follow linearly to zero. So we can't just, unlike a liquid, we can't just do, we just can't put the Navier-Stokes equations and set an effective viscosity or something like that. We have to turn to a different way of modeling it. And one of the ways that people have done this is looking at this local model of granular materials. Because they're so heterogeneous, rather than taking a global average, what we can do is look at the local information. So local rheology says that the resistance to flow or the effective friction coefficient should just depend on the local shear rate. And so what I mean by that is that the local stress ratio, the bulk or the ratio of stress to pressure for a system that looks like this, is going to be calculated locally. So rather than looking at all of the data, we can just look at a local area. And then from that, you can look at the local stress field and figure out, okay, this is how fast this particle should be moving. And if we're below some critical, and granular materials are kind of like a yield stress fluid. We're below a critical stress ratio, there should be no flow. And then above that, we should get lots of flow. So think about that in terms of your pile of sand. If you build a very shallow pile of sand, we expect it not to flow. But if we build a very steep pile of sand, it will flow as a function of time because it's unstable to gravity. There's also another dimensionless number that we care about here called the inertial number, which is, you can think of as the ratio between a microscopic timescale and a macroscopic timescale. And the microscopic timescale is defined roughly as the amount of time it takes for a particle to be squeezed into a hole the size of itself. And the macroscopic timescale is set by the shear rate of the system. And so this is where we end up with the inertial number. And the models have, people who have done the modeling say that the bulk friction coefficient or the stress ratio should depend on the inertial number. So the faster you strain the system, the harder it is to strain. And you might know this by walking on sand, for instance. If you wanted to walk more quickly, or walk more easily, you would run on it rather than walk. But that becomes a little bit of a problem. Maybe that analogy doesn't quite work because you're exerting more effort. We're not great we as people are not great rheometers. So ignore that one. But essentially the bulk friction, this is called mu of I rheology, that says that the faster you move, the harder it is to move. And this model, although simple, kind of works. But there's some places where it really does not capture the information. So the first is that flow can exist below a critical stress ratio. So this is also called creep. So I said below a certain angle of our sand pile, we shouldn't see flow. And this is not true because we see this in nature. So for example, this picture of a tree here these trees were initially straight up out of the ground. But then with time, this hill slope has changed and then the tree has rotated itself in order to grow upwards again. So you can see that initially the normal used to be in this direction. Or the direction of gravity used to be pointing that way. and that's, in a system that's messy, it's a forest, it has all of these different processes like freeze thaw and water and who knows what else happened. But you see creep even in the most controlled settings, where this is a sand pile again, and you can see these microscopic tiny motions that for a system that's below this critical stress ratio. So this is called creep. We also see failure of local rheology models, looking at the size of the shear band. So the size of the shear band should just depend on the local stress ratio, but we see that it really also depends on the geometry and the grain size of the system. As well, if you vibrate a granular material over one side very far away from your area that you're looking at, you can see that it fluidizes other areas. I don't have a good example of this, but this is a literature review slide for those that are interested. So to build on the local rheology model, folks have said, well, if it's not just strain rate that controls flow and yield point, what else is there? And so there's this idea that particle rearrangements in one area can trigger rearrangements in another area. And the resistance to flow is this combination of the two, both the local shear rate and these non-local events. I'm not going to get into too much detail about how these non-local rheology models work. I will point you to the theory papers that work this out, as well as some experimental work that's done on the annulus that I will be showing you for those of you that are interested. But essentially it says that there's this longer length scale, a mesoscale, if you will, that affects how these rearrangements occur. And so what I want to talk to you about is how the force network affects the bulk friction coefficient. And I'm going to do this in two different ways. The first is looking at the structure of these force networks and the fabric network, as well as how to understand the structure of the material. And so this is the first half of my results. And the second half of my results, I'll be using it to talk about looking at local information like these particle-particle interactions to understand what causes rigidity or yielding of the material. So first off, the structure portion of the talk was in collaboration with Emilia Azema at the Université de Montpellier and Ephraim Billyline, a former undergraduate student in the Daniels lab. So to motivate this, I probably hopefully driven home this point, but Deguaboy took these frictionless packing of particles and in simulation, and what they did was shear it at different angles. So they made multiple copies of the same packing and then began to shear either at 90 degrees, so pure shear, or they were able to shear it at different angles. And what they found was that the shear modulus really changed depending on what angle you're applying that shear. So there's an inherent anisotropy to the system. And the other thing that they found was that if you took these exact same particles, prepared them in exactly the same way, but in different places, so they prepared it by compressing them into this box, but they moved the particles around, and they found that the shear modulus really varied quite a bit depending on how you pack these particles, which indicates that the packing is important. And for a dynamic system, Da Cruz et al. Did the simulation of packing of the shear or the bulk friction coefficient as a function of the inertial number. And then they were able to look at what's the orientation of the forces inside of this packing. And they found that it's highly anisotropic, and they typically line up in the direction of shear. So these are the normal forces on the left and the tangential forces on the right. And so maybe this result in the bulk shouldn't be a surprise when we start to look at how the forces are oriented. And so we can look at anisotropy and like how these forces are distributed in granular materials in a couple of different ways. The first is by something called the fabric, which I want you to think of as the orientation of the contacts and their grain shape. I work with circles, so I don't have to think about grain shape. So in the bottom left, we have a isotropic packing, which means that there's no set preference to the direction of the particles or which direction they have a contact. Versus in the top right, where we have a perfectly anisotropic packing, everything is either lined up in the horizontal or the vertical, and all the particle grains are lined up like rice. So you could think about that as pneumatic order, if you will. or a liquid crystal ordering. And then in the other two corners, we have something that's in between isotropic and perfectly isotropic and perfectly anisotropic. And beyond just the fabric, we can also look at the forces. So if we compressed these photoelastic particles isotropically, we see an isotropic force pattern. But if we shear the material, we see this really anisotropic force pattern. We have these really horizontally oriented forces. And the question that I want to pose to you is, can we look at anisotropy in these granular packings and understand things like the bulk friction mod or effective bulk friction coefficient? And back in 1989, there was a paper by Rothenberg and Bathurst, who's part of the geotechnical community. And what they did was they simulated about 1,000 frictional grains, and they compressed it biaxially, so stronger in the vertical direction than they did in the horizontal direction. And then they looked at how these contacts are distributed. So they found that there's more contacts in the vertical direction than there are in the horizontal direction. That makes sense. And then they did what every good scientist would do, and they fit a nice Fourier expansion to this shape, where they said the probability of finding a contact at any given angle is 1 plus some anisotropy factor that will grow in your preferred direction. So you can imagine that if A gets larger and larger, we get a more elongated shape. But if it's 0, we get a perfectly round distribution. They did this as well for the normal forces. So looking at which direction the strongest normal forces are facing, and they fit a similar Fourier expansion. And then they did it as well for the tangential forces, where at any given contact, a tangential force can have either a positive or negative or clockwise or counterclockwise preference. So pointing left or right. And so you see this characteristic butterfly shape that corresponds to essentially, if you're pushing a particle in, you get tangential forces moving outwards. And so they fit a slightly different functional form, but the same general idea. And so they developed this thing called the stress force fabric relation that says that if you look at the bulk friction coefficient that they've plotted here as a function of strain, and compare it to the half sum of these 3 anisotropy measures, so how peanut-like these distributions look, they should match pretty well. And this was done rigorously by Lee and Yu in 2013. And so they say that the bulk friction, which is the ratio of our two stresses, is the sum of these particle scale information. And effectively allowing us to relate macro scale to micro scale. And up until recently, this had yet to be proven with experimental data. So obviously that's what I'm going to be telling you about. And this was done, these experiments were done initially by Ephraim Billyline back in 2015, 2016. And he took the photoelastic particles and placed them on an air table, which I want you to think like an air hockey table. So they're kind of floating on the surface. There's no basal friction between these particles and the surface, but there is friction between the particles themselves. And there's about 1,000 of these particles, and again, a bidispersed mixture. And what he did was he compressed these particles. First, he did it so uniaxially. And then he compressed them again. So we got multiple different loadings, different packings as well. And then he did this for isotropic compression, as well as pure shear, where he compressed from one side and expanded from the other. And what he did here is he did this quasi-statically. So he compressed a little bit, or he strained a little bit and then took a picture, strained a little bit and then took a picture. So this wasn't a dynamic process. And then what I did was I went back almost a decade later and reanalyzed all of his data so that we could find all of the little itty-bitty contacts between all of these particles and start building our information. So from the photoelastic grain solver, we're able to get the vector forces and contact vectors between all of these particles, allowing us to build our microscopic stress tensor, which is essentially the outer product of the contact direction and the vector, the force vector direction. And so we can sum this up over all of our particles that are in contact with each other and begin to build our stress tensor, which is just looking at the compression from the X and the Y, as well as the two shear. And when we do this for different loadings, if I plot the stress as a function of frame number, which is kind of arbitrary here. I'm showing you 5 different loadings. We can see that the stress tensor changes quite a bit depending on our initial packing, which again calls back to the Boy paper where the initial packing is really important. And then I'm going to skip a couple of steps in the math, but what we're able to do is extract the effective friction coefficient from the stress tensor, which again is the ratio of shear to pressure. And so what we can do is plot this as a function of strain. And we can see a couple of different things. The first is that overall we see a strain softening. The other thing that I should have mentioned first is that the colors correspond to different loadings. So for example, this pink set of dots down here corresponds to one loading, and then the maroon up here corresponds to a different loading. So individual experiments. Other than that, we could take some averages and say this for a system like this, we expect this is how the bulk friction coefficient should evolve with strain. But to really understand where it's coming from, we can turn to the anisotropies. So here I'm showing you the distribution of the contacts, the normal forces, and the tangential forces for this pure sheared system. And you can see that the contacts and normal forces align pretty strongly in the horizontal, and that's what we expect to see based on just looking at it with our eyes. We also see this butterfly shape appear where we have a clockwise and counterclockwise preference, just as Rothenberg and Bathurst predicted. And this was averaged over all of those frames for all of those loadings, but what we can do is start to bin it according to strain. So starting from low strain and going to high strain, you might notice that the low strain system is very, very anisotropic. All of the forces are aligned in the horizontal direction, even if we normalize by the average force. But in the high strain case, we start to see some vertical forces appear. And so if I plot our distributions, what we end up seeing is that we go from something that's very anisotropic, we get this dumbbell or bow tie shape, to something that's less anisotropic, where we form this ellipsoidal shape. So as we increase the strain, we get less anisotropic. And what I can do to show you this quantitatively, I can unwrap the shape of these profiles and plot them instead now as the probability distribution of our contacts as a function of angle for all of our distributions here. And then this was at very low strain, but I can plot it at increasing strain from purple to green. And you can see that the amplitude in particular for the contacts has decreased. And if I remind you back to our Fourier expansions, the amplitude of our sinusoid should correspond to the level of anisotropy. And so I can extract the level of anisotropy from these 3 metrics or these 3 distributions and plot those instead as a function of strain. And so you can see that the anisotropy in the fabric decreases, as well as the normal forces and the tangential forces. And the other thing that I want to point out to you here is that the anisotropy in fabric tends to dominate. The contacts are highly anisotropic, and they're about double the anisotropy in the normal forces, and the anisotropy in the tangential forces is about an order of magnitude less. I point this out because we care about the summation of these 3. And the anisotropy and the tangential forces tell us, or that's very small, tell us that really interparticle friction doesn't seem to matter in this system. There's a very small effect compared to just pressing the particles into each other. And so what we can do is go back to this plot that I showed you before of the bulk friction coefficient as a function of strain that we calculated from the stress tensor. And now I can plot the summation of these 3 anisotropies with no fitting parameters right on top. And we see it really follows the average behavior quite well. And I can do this not just for the pure shear case, I can do it for the uniaxial compression, and I can do it for the isotropic compression as well. And so this tells us that the stress force fabric does a good job of predicting what the bulk friction coefficient should be. Now, of course, this was done quasi or statically, so let's look at a dynamic system in the annulus. I've shown you this video before, but it's so pretty, so I'll show it to you again. And what we can do is exactly the same thing, except switching into polar coordinates, and we can look at what the effective friction coefficient will be as a function of strain as we rotate this the annulus around a full rotation. And so what I want you to see is that initially we see this strain softening, a decrease in the bulk friction coefficient, and then it begins to kind of meander its way up to a steady state. And I want to point out that it looks like it's noisy, but it's actually distinct events that are happening. And this is really obvious when we plot the effective friction or the sum of these anisotropies on top. You can see it follows these spikes and jumps really nicely. So it captures this intermittent dynamic behavior that may look something like this in one image, and then just a little bit of strain later, we end up seeing very, very few forces. So we hit a steady state, but it's not static. There's this intermittency that we expect from granular materials. And you might say, okay, but I don't have your fancy photoelastic particles. How do you expect me to do this on a regular particulate system? And so I want you to think back about how the fabric in the system really dominated. And so what we can do is plot just the fabric. So we essentially say that the tangential force is equal to 0. And we say that, you know what, A and AN, let's just sum them together and call it A. And so what we end up seeing that although it underpredicts the bulk friction coefficient by about a 30%, it still captures all of those dynamics. So if you're looking at, if you're interested in relative behavior, this might be an interesting tool to think about how anisotropic is your contact network. And maybe this is interesting if you look at tissues, or if you look at cellular foam or foams, or maybe even metamorphic rock. So you imagine something that is highly anisotropic might be a little bit stronger than something that's less anisotropic. And so what I want you to take away from this structure section is that it's really the anisotropy in these granular systems that control the bulk rheology. And the stress force fabric relation is a useful tool for understanding this. And it works in all of these different loading histories and conditions, and it describes transient behavior, which I think is really cool from a dynamics point of view. And maybe I'll pause and see if there's any questions here before I move on to the rigidity section.
I don't see anyone
Okay.
asking questions right now. Maybe they're a bit shy today. I don't know.
Continue.
Or maybe they're waiting for the rigid part. So
Yeah, okay.
let's see.
So let's move on to the rigidity part. So can we understand rigidity or yielding, depending on how you look at it? So this work was done in collaboration with Jen Schwartz at Syracuse University and Silke Henkes at Leiden University. And the way that we have been using this is by looking at stick slip dynamics. So making our system yield over and over and over again, because we can't just make it yield once. And so going back to this idea of the earthquake, we often see this in these intermittencies in how we see earthquakes essentially when we see a slip event happen after a stick. We see stick slip dynamics as well in dense colloidal systems. So this is a drying dense colloidal droplet, and you can see as it dried, it leaves behind these rings of particles or colloids that are the result of the contact line sticking as a function of time. So we get this stick and slip behavior. So there's areas points in time where it's moving a lot or drying quickly, retracting quickly, and then points in time when it's stuck. And we also see it in frictionless materials. So this is a two-dimensional emulsion, and you can see we see this clog form, and then this clog could unstick or it could continue to stick with time. So the canonical example of stick slip dynamics is a coupled block and spring system, where if you pull on the spring, you're going to increase the force on the system until suddenly the force on the spring exceeds the frictional force and we slip forward. And so you can see that this is characteristic jagged force system behavior, as well as the position jumping forward with time. And of course, this is a cartoon example where everything is very regular, but in reality, you could have behavior that goes from high stick, or they call it stiction, to something that is very smooth and sliding. And the distribution of these stick and slip behaviors is something that is of quite a bit of interest in terms of mean field theory and renormalization group. And you're familiar with this because if you count the number of earthquakes as a function of their magnitude, it follows this really nice power law, and which says that you should expect many, many, many very small earthquakes that we don't even notice to highly devastating, very, very few highly devastating earthquakes. And in a granular system, you might think about this in terms of the frictional jamming diagram, which is this ratio of shear stress, or the relationship between shear stress and packing fraction. And so you can end up in a case where you're shear jammed, stuck because you're sheared together. And then you increase the shear stress on the system until suddenly you unjam. And then you fall back down. And then you repeat over and over again. So the question is, can we take a granular system like this and use the local information to understand stick-slip dynamics? So when we see this jamming occur, or when we see rigidity occur. And one of those ways that we do that is by thinking about the number of constraints in our system versus the degrees of freedom. And to explain this to you, I'm going to point to this very simple ball and magnet toy. For those of you who have played with this before, you'll know that it's shaped like this, or if you've built an IKEA furniture before, you know that it's floppy until you add in an additional constraint. So we've satisfied all of the degrees of freedom here, so now it's rigid. And the way that we do this in granular materials is through something called the frictional pebble game. So we assign 3 degrees of freedom for each particle, which we call pebbles. And then we look at the network of forces that each of these particles are associated. And then we can assign constraints. So we can assign 2 bonds if there's a frictional contact because they're stuck and can't slide, and then versus a sliding contact where the particles can't move through each other, but they can slide past each other. And so what we can do is walk around our network of particles and the network of neighbors and say, and if we end up placing all of the particles, or placing all of our frictional bonds, and we're left with 3 remaining degrees of freedom, then we know this area is rigid, because now these 3 remaining degrees of freedom just correspond to being able to move our rigid cluster around and rotate it. And so we can map this back onto our granular system and say this is a rigid cluster. And you can go and by looking at the system, you can go from something that has no rigid clusters to something that's called rigidity percolating, where there's a rigid cluster that spans from one side of the system to the other. And typically you would expect that we see a rigid cluster form and begin to percolate when we see solid-like behavior happening. I forget what comes next. Oh, we do this in experiment. So the way that we do this in an experiment is again with the annulus. And what I didn't tell you for the previous experiment is that we have a sneaky 2 modes in our annulus. We can run it at constant strain rate, or we can run it in stick slip by essentially we have a torsional spring inside the drive shaft of our annulus. And so when we see the strength of the material is less than the strength of our spring, we see a slip event happening because the spring takes over and we push the system out. So just like a mass and spring system. And to show you why this looks a little bit different than the constant strain rate system, I want you to look at the rotation of the arrow as I shear the system. And what you can see down here is the rotation as a function of time goes through these jumps, which is a little bit difficult to see on this scale. But you can see that it kind of looks a little bit different than the previous video, where now we have this intermittent behavior that's due to the inner wheel rather than due to the particles themselves. And really, to convince you of this, we have a torque sensor on the inside of our drive shaft, which looks at how much torque we have to apply in order to move the wheel. And you can see these characteristic jumps that look just like a stick slip behavior. And maybe to really convince you of this, I can plot the difference in rotation as a function of time. And you can see these really big spikes occur with lots of rotation that happens when we see this decrease in the normalized torque. So that means that we see a lot of rotation that corresponds to all these particles rearranging. So now that I've hopefully convinced you that we are running in stick slip mode, I can now take my photoelastic image, skip many steps, and we have our force network, and then skip many steps again, run it through the Pebble game, allowing us to take this really messy, complicated physical system and turn it into just a network of whether or not we have something that's rigid, a rigid cluster corresponding to these color areas. So we have a really big one here shown in blue, or we have floppy areas that are under constrained, shown in gray. And so that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to look at where the rigid clusters form, where these constrained areas are as we apply it, as we look back at that video again. And so you can see we start off something that's rigid percolating. It's fully, we have a spanning rigid cluster from one side to the other. And if I play this video, you can see that it breaks up sometimes. We see them form in some places, and then they break up during a slip event. We see them kind of form in other places. Sometimes they stick, sometimes they don't. And so if I plot for you, this is the same data that I showed you on the other slide. But in the green is the number of particles that are participating in a rigid cluster as a function of time. And what you can see is that we get this regular increase in the number of particles that are in a cluster that typically corresponds to an increase in torque. And the other thing that I want to show is the green background corresponds to whether or not there's a spanning rigid cluster at any given time. And so it seems like these rigid clusters break up when we have a slip event. And really what that tells us is that it's the rigid clusters that are holding back the system. When they break, when we get yielding, is when we see this rotation. And I want to really point out that it's not about how much force there is in the system. This image here, which has arguably more forces compared to the image on the right, has no rigid area, versus this particle here, or this system here, which has a very, very small spanning rigid cluster, but it still exists. So it's not necessarily about how much force there is in the system or how strong the forces are. It's about the network of forces. And you can think about this as if you have a pile of tennis balls, you press down really hard, that's going to be unstable. You need to have something supporting from the side in order for it to be rigid. You have to satisfy the number of degrees of freedom in the system. And so what we started looking at was, what is the pressure on a given particle? Based on the normal force. If we sum up the normal forces multiplied by the contact direction for a given area, what we're able to find is that if we sum this up for every single particle in all of these frames, but then average them based on whether they're in a cluster or whether they're in their floppy area, what we end up finding is that the average pressure increases disproportionately if we're in a spanning rigid cluster. And this tells us that it's really the rigid areas that are withstanding all of the force in this system. And when we see this break up is when we see this decrease in the pressure. And this we find really interesting, because this is really the first, for taking something that's so messy and physical like this annulus, and then just saying, okay, are they in contact or not? Do we have enough degrees of freedom? Tells us something about how the pressure is supported in this system. And so with that, I've told you two stories about how structure and rigidity are in a granular system are affected by their constituent parts, essentially. And we're able to look at that the flow is determined by the anisotropy in both the fabric and the forces. And we're also able to see that these rigid areas end up breaking and yielding when we see a stick slip event. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Carmen. It was Wow. I really enjoy your presentation, I must say. Is there any question from the audience? Oh, yeah, there's one question in the chat. This was really great from Crystal. I learned a lot. Do you expect the same in 3D as in 2D?
Yeah, so that's the ultimate question, right? I know, and Michelle, I know you've thought about 3D and rigidity percolating. I think currently you can't play the Pebble game in 3D. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for what
I
reason
mean,
exactly? Yeah.
Um,
Michelle,
I
you can
think,
also answer if you
is
already
yeah.
like
oh,
the
I mean,
discussion is
I
is really interesting anyway. Like
Yeah, I just know that at least there isn't an algorithm created. I don't know if theoretically you would be able to.
well, that's the problem. It's that really theoretically the Pebble game fails. The theory behind a Pebble game literally fails in 3D. Um, there is a you can demonstrate that mathematically, and in a very practical way, the problem in 3D is that, well, like in 2D, what you have is that 2 points. Let's imagine you have a perfectly rolling contact with an infinite friction coefficient, for example. Well, 2 points. 1 point of a particle will always be in one contact, 1 point, sorry, of the other contacting particle. And if you change the rotation, that those 2 points can only be in contact with each other. Okay, so the first contact on one particle cannot be in contact with another particle, otherwise that would be sliding. However, in 3D, if you have spheres, if you have two contacts, if you block one, for example, then you can actually rotate the other one with a perfectly rolling contact and come back with a different point contacting the previous point on the second particle. So that's something like an apparent sliding, which the Pebble game cannot actually understand. They would see it as a failure of the so as a floppy mode, even if the number of constraints would be the same. However, I would also like to say that there is a paper, I don't remember the authors. It's a pretty recent paper that they showed they applied. So in 2D, you apply what we call a 3-3 Pebble game. That's 3 degrees of freedom, three constraints for rigidity. In 3D, I think that you would have to apply the 4-6 Pebble game, if I remember well the order of the numbers. But the point being that they tried the algorithm with other more precise but also more expensive algorithm to find rigidity. And they practically showed that even though it can fail sometimes, the Pebble game in 3D, the statistics are usually the same. So I'm not sure there is at least available online any 3D algorithm for the Pebble game, so somebody should write it. But and I'm thinking about it. But one can use it if you're interested in the statistics, and that's a very important information. It's useful.
Yeah.
It may
Thank
be
you.
very useful. And
Uh,
that brings me to also a question I had about statistics. Have you tried to I mean, here you never varied the volume fraction, right? Volume fraction, the packing fraction,
mhm,
and or so also here in the stick slip mode, you apply a stress, a shear stress.
mhm.
Have you tried to change that?
Yeah, so we are pretty constrained experimentally of what we can do. I will say I have varied the packing fraction. I have two different packing fractions that I am working on. It just these running it through all of these analyses take a while. Um, uh, so we will have two packing fractions that we'll be able to see, but you can imagine if we went to higher and higher packing fraction, we were constrained because the particles begin to pop out of plane and
Yeah.
then the experiment is over. If we go to too few packing fractions, we don't actually get rigid spanning clusters across the system. Um, and we get into a more fragile state where we, so finding the correct packing fraction at the at this approximate stress strain rate that we're moving at took a little while.
Because, sorry, are you constraining the particles to be in a plane?
No, gravity constrains them.
Okay.
And then sometimes I have to go back in and poke them if I see them popping out.
And so do you have some friction with the bottom plate then?
Yes, there is friction, basal friction between the particles in the bottom plate, which we've estimated to be at least an order of magnitude smaller than the interparticle friction. It's a little bit difficult to measure directly, but you can actually get it from the non-local rheology models. I forget what your other part of the question was.
No, I mean, if you ever looked at the statistics of these for example, the fraction of rigid particles, and
yeah,
I mean, but then I would look at it varying the shear stress, for example.
Yeah. So I think that would require taking out the spring inside of the drive shaft and changing them to a different spring. And back when Ted Brzezinski built this instrument in 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they really found that any stiffer than this and you just blow through the particles, and any floppier and you end up just getting really big stick slip behavior. So we found that for the softness of our particles, this tended to be just about right. I think we have one other set, but that requires taking everything out and aligning everything. So we decided to just stick with this system and work on getting statistics by running it around and around and around instead.
It's very cool anyway.
Yeah.
It's very nice. And have you ever tried to, I mean, this is granular material, and you know what the systems I'm working with. Have you ever tried to add some liquid?
Some liquid in between to see if there's adhesion. Thank you, Michelle.
Because it's a really nice experimental setup, and I see. I mean, I'm not used to this kind of photoelastic particles, but would they work also with a liquid, or is photoelasticity hard to detect if there is a liquid? How does it work?
Yeah, so if someone wants to hire me for a faculty position, I would love to explore that. We do know from preliminary work at Iowa State and Jacqueline Reber's group that you can put fluid in between the particles and they won't die. If you add water, the polymer is slightly hygroscopic, so it will change the physical properties of these grains, and then I think they don't dry out quite right. So using a polymer, Ted Brzezinski cuts his particles using coconut oil as the lubricant. So I think you could do an oil. You end up seeing, so you can still see force networks or contact forces between the particles when they're wet. So I think it's possible. I think Karen would actually murder me if I tried to put liquid in this system, because it's not meant for that. There's no fluid gap between the system and the motor, the very expensive motor. But I think you can definitely devise a system to look at the effect of capillary bridging and the effect of lubrication.
And in terms of optics, would it change something if the index on this, if I'm sorry. Will it change something if you have like a liquid that has a optical index that is like very different from air, or would it not change anything with the?
I don't think so, because the plane, we're just looking through a straight plane.
Yeah.
So I think,
and because your particles are in the green and in the red, but if the liquid is not transparent, for example, or if the liquid reflects or deviates your colors, I guess that you will not see the real forces, but maybe a force that is a bit deviated, like by refraction or refraction.
I think you can get around that though by just looking at the ratio of like normalizing by the maximum force or the average force though, and then you just have renormalized.
Yeah.
But it would be easier for the particles to pop out of the plane too, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah,
I mean, I don't know. But it's just that it seems to be a very, I mean, it's a very nice experimental setup, and
yeah.
it
And
would
I
be
think,
interesting to use it also for suspensions
yeah.
somehow.
And also, so, there's so many questions. Here it's like 10 centimeter, the thing. So oh, you have bidispersed ones here or
Yes,
not?
yes.
Yeah.
They're
Okay.
weakly bidisperse.
Okay. And have you tried to change a lot like the bidispersity or to add another one to do something polydisperse or not?
We have not, because
Okay.
yeah, again, making the particles is difficult. So it would
Yeah.
be really
Okay. It's
nice
the main
to,
issue to
yeah.
make them.
There's no reason why you couldn't though.
Yeah.
As long as the particles are large enough that we do have really big particles.
Oh.
And I know Kirsten Nordstrom's group at Holyoke College, Mount Holyoke, are looking at a big photoelastic intruder into a smaller network of photoelastic particles.
Yeah.
And it should still be solvable. It's just a question of getting if you make your particles too small, either they are taller than they are wide and they fall over,
Okay. Yeah.
or you don't have the resolution on the camera.
Okay. I
So
see.
currently this is the fanciest camera that we own, and it takes pictures at like each picture is half a gigabyte or something like that per frame. And it's just barely high resolution enough to
Yeah.
be able to resolve the forces.
Wow.
Wow.
So you did a
So
lot of analysis on that.
yes.
Wow.
So for this annulus that's about a meter wide, we need to have like as big as a sensor that we can buy.
Yeah.
So
Wow. Sorry.
at least for
That's
now, this is as big as we can go. Or like
okay.
the system size ratio is as big as we can go.
Yeah, I see. I see. I see. That is really cool.
And would you say that the okay, so I have two questions, but I'm gonna ask them separately. So you showed a video about that, and it seemed that the regions where you had the strongest four chains or also correspond to the rigid clusters.
Mhm.
Is that true? Is it always true?
It's not,
I mean, there is a signature in the stress, and you showed that. I mean, in the torque, which
yeah.
is so there is definitely something.
That's next on my analysis once I get enough data sets analyzed, is looking at like what's the mean average force inside of a cluster versus outside the cluster, and you kind of see that in the pressure.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, I think theoretically it doesn't have to be the case.
The picture on the right, it does looks like where you have that system spanning rigid cluster on the top right, let's say at
Yeah.
45 angles, that corresponds to that exactly. On the
Yes.
left, that's unclear because you have many four chains that seem to be system spanning, but there is no rigid cluster that's spanning the whole system.
So what we've kind of been thinking is like we want to step away from thinking about where are the strongest force chains in the system, because a lot of previous analysis has looked at, okay, where's the strongest force chains, and we'll only look at that. But I think for rigidity, you really, really need all of those little contacts to help support maybe the main forces as they span. So sometimes I'll see a system like down here is very, very strong force, but it ends up not even appearing really on our network.
Yeah. And well, this signature you see, by the way, they remind me a lot the paper by Emanuela Delgado. I don't know
Okay.
if you've seen the work. That's
I have,
from
but I have not read it.
2020. I think it's 2020. Oh, I don't remember. 4, 3, 2022. I don't remember. It's Goya, the first author.
Okay.
And they show some signature between in the stress with they use the K some version of the K core analysis, not really the same idea as the K core, is slightly modified in a very smart way. But yeah. And the second question I had is there any possible, okay, now I have another question in mind too. So another two questions. The first question is, do you have any way to actually measure particle dynamics and not just I'm talking about the rotations?
Ah, currently no. We only have access to the straight the translational kinematics, but not the
Can you like paint a line on each particle and track the
We do.
angle?
We actually do have particles that have 3 dots on them,
Yeah.
like 3 Sharpie dots, with the intention of being able to track the rotation.
Yeah.
We have not used those currently because they're slightly worse quality of particle, but sometime in the future, we've been working on looking at gluing trimers together. Or no, we have taken data where we've glued these 3 particles together to form a trimer. And so as a rigid inclusion, if you will. And then so this is done with Abrar Nasir at ISC Bangalore. And the idea is that we would be able to see how the rigid inclusions both increase the structural rigidity in the system, but also how they rotate.
Funny also because 3 particles is already a rigid structure. Oh.
So he's ended up having, so he did a lot of work with dimers, but now we've included a trimer into the system so you can see it like bend a little. So there's a bending mode as well.
Nice. And
currently no access to rotation, but maybe soon.
If you get the faculty position.
Yeah.
Last question for now. Can you control the particle rigidity?
Like the Young's modulus?
Stiffness.
Yeah.
You'd have to make new particles.
No, of course, yeah.
Yeah, but yes, you can.
How you can? Okay.
I know Natalie Vreen's group at Boulder is working on creating like the particles with tunable stiffness. Nice. And we do have particles that have, photoelasticity is any plastic essentially is photoelastic. PMMA, you often see it on bus stops. Like if you're looking at the bus shelter and then you're wearing polarized sunglasses, you can see the stress field. It's just the matter of like, how hard do you want to drive your system? Yeah. So these are definitely like quite soft. They're like gummy bears or pencil erasers, but we have particles that are rather hard. It's just how much do you want to crank on it?
Yeah. Oh, I'm asking this just because that's what we see in simulations, that it changes quite a lot. The onset of these rigid clusters. It's much easier for soft particles to actually to see some spanning rigid clusters.
Oh, interesting. I guess
they can liquid even more easily the hard ones.
Yeah.
You can squish. That's the idea I have in mind. But a soft one can actually, it's easier to constrain. It's going to stay in that position longer, while the hard one immediately wants to get out of the cluster.
Yeah, because I guess in addition to having interparticle friction, you also have a little bit of flattening of your contact.
That's something extremely hard to model in simulations. That's something we don't do. But that's why I was asking if you could do it in experiments, because you just have it then.
Yeah, in theory, yes.
Yeah, you can play so much with this system. That's why it's so nice. Then you're saying the surface flattens, and why not adhesion?
Yeah, exactly. And so you could, that's what we were playing around with the trimers, is like introducing some cohesive particles, but like very controlled cohesion. And then you could just go all in and just like add capillary bridges to everything.
Oh, if you add some liquid, you can make the particles hydrophobic or hydrophilic, and then
Michelle is gonna hire you, okay?
well, if I could, I would.
Yeah.
Well, I think the video for now is a bit long. We can continue this discussion.
Yeah.
After we're gonna say goodbye to YouTube for now. So thank you a lot, Carmen, for your presentation. We loved it. We still have so many questions. I feel like Michelle still has a lot of questions, and I hope you're gonna find a position where you will be able to apply all of those things you have done, because it's a lot. It's a lot. Thank you for everyone to attend, and if you want to stay for a little chat, very little, because I need to go. Bye, everyone. Thank you a lot, Carmen.
Thank you.